There's something fascinating about the way we react to endings. Not just endings in life, but endings in stories, especially the stories that become cultural monoliths. And Stranger Things, for better or worse, is one of those monoliths. Even as someone who has never watched a single episode, I can't escape it. It's everywhere. It's the kind of show that becomes so omnipresent that it actually pushes me away. I'm the type of person who loses interest the moment something becomes too popular. It's the same reason I bounced off Rick and Morty after 4 episodes. Not just because of the Szechuan sauce fiasco, but because I genuinely couldn't understand what people were losing their minds over. But even from the outside, I can recognize when a finale becomes a cultural event. And the Stranger Things finale absolutely did. It arrived with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for the Super Bowl or a Taylor Swift album drop. Critics weighed in, audiences weighed in, and almost immediately, the divide between the two became the story. Critics seemed more positive, audiences more mixed, and that tension created the perfect storm for what came next. The rise of a conspiracy-style fan theory claiming that the finale we saw wasn't the real finale. This is where things get interesting. Not because the theory is convincing, but because it reveals something deeper about modern fandom. The theory, known as the Conformity Gate, suggests that Netflix released a fake ending to Stranger Things, and that a true ending exists somewhere hidden away to be released later. It's the kind of idea that could only exist in the age of Reddit threads, TikTok speculation, and a fandom culture that has been trained to expect twists, reveals, and secret lore behind every corner. But before we get into why the theory falls apart, it's worth understanding why it exists in the first place. The finale didn't land cleanly. It didn't unite the fan base. It didn't deliver the kind of emotional catharsis that people expect from a show that dominated the cultural conversation for nearly a decade. And when a finale doesn't satisfy, fans start looking for explanations. They start looking for meaning. They start looking for something, just anything, that makes the disappointment feel intentional. That's how you get theories like the Conformity Gate. But let's be clear. The finale we got is the finale. There is no hidden version, there is no alternate cut waiting to be unveiled, and the simplest way to prove it is to look at Netflix's own behavior. Netflix released the finale in theaters. Think about that. Why would a studio go through the logistical and financial effort of a theatrical rollout for a fake ending? Why would they risk the backlash of a bait and switch on a global scale? That kind of move wouldn't just annoy fans, it would permanently damage the legacy of the show. It would become the defining story of Stranger Things. Every retrospective, every documentary, every anniversary piece would bring it up. It would overshadow everything the show accomplished. Oscar Wilde once said that the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. But I'll one-up that with something a little more practical and something more related to this. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Audiences don't forgive deception. Not in the streaming era, not when trust is already fragile, not when people are paying for 5 different services just to watch the shows they used to get in one place. And if you want an example of how studios respond to fan backlash, look no further than the petition to remake Season 8 of Game of Thrones. Nearly 2 million signatures, a cultural uprising. And HBO's response? Casey Bloys said essentially, we hear you, but no. He acknowledged the passion, but he also made it clear that redoing a finale is not something any network would seriously consider. If HBO wouldn't redo the most hated finale of the decade, why would Netflix secretly redo a finale that was merely divisive? But the more interesting angle here is the one raised by The Guardian. The Stranger Things finale wasn't bad, it was safe, predictable, down the middle. It didn't take big swings, it didn't crash and burn, it didn't soar either, it just existed. And that's the real problem, because in storytelling, safe is often the most forgettable choice. Breaking Bad, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and Mad Men are remembered because they stuck the landing with confidence. How I Met Your Mother, Dexter, and Lost are remembered because they crashed spectacularly. But a finale that sits in the middle, that's the one that fades. And that brings me to a useful counterexample, one that also happens to be a Netflix original series, at least in its later seasons, and that was Cobra Kai. Now let me be clear, I have my own issues with Cobra Kai. That's a whole separate video entirely. But the finale to Cobra Kai, the finale works. It's beloved. It has a 9.5 out of 10 on IMDb, and that's not an accident. The reason it works is beautifully simple. Cobra Kai began with Johnny and Miguel, and it ended with Johnny and Miguel. That's it. That's the secret. The show's emotional core was never the karate, never the rivalries, never the nostalgia. It was the relationship between a broken man trying to rebuild his life and a kid who needed a father figure. Season 1 ends with Miguel becoming All Valley champion, the moment that cements Johnny's comeback. And in the penultimate episode of the final season, Miguel becomes world champion, completing his arc as the student who rose above every obstacle. That victory forces Johnny to step into the ring himself, not as Daniel's rival, not as the washed-up antagonist from the 80s, but as a man reclaiming his own story. And when Johnny wins the global tournament, it mirrors the end of the Karate Kid, except this time, he is the one who triumphs. It's poetic symmetry. The student rises, the mentor redeems himself. The show ends where it began, but with the roles transformed. Fans love that. Fans crave that. Not because it's surprising, but because it's emotionally honest. Cobra Kai didn't hide its ending. It didn't try to subvert expectations. It simply paid off the story it promised from the beginning. And that's the key difference. Stranger Things didn't deliver that kind of emotional symmetry. It didn't close the loop in a way that felt inevitable. It didn't give fans the sense that the story had come full circle. And when a finale doesn't feel complete, fans start looking for explanations. They start looking for hidden meaning. They start looking for a real ending that must exist somewhere. But the truth is much simpler. The ending we got is the ending. This middle ground, where a finale neither soars nor crashes, leaves a space that fans instinctively seek to fill. Whether through critique, disappointment, or elaborate fan theories, this void becomes fertile ground for meaning making. That's where the boring versus bad principle becomes important. Because in storytelling, boring is the one thing audiences never rally around. Okay, just hear me out. You can make a good movie. Hell, you can make a bad movie. But if you make a boring movie, God help you. That's the stuff that disappears. Meanwhile, spectacular failures, the ones that crash and burn in unforgettable ways, end up with midnight screenings and cult followings. Plan 9 from Outer Space, Troll 2, Samurai Cop, these films survive because they fail loudly, not quietly. And that brings us to one of the most useful analogies in entertainment. The Producers and Tommy Wiseau's The Room. Two very different works separated by decades, but united by the same phenomenon. The accidental comedy. Okay, if you've never seen the movie, in The Producers, the entire scam hinges on creating the worst musical imaginable. The protagonist deliberately buy a pro-Hitler script written by a former Nazi, hire the worst director, cast the worst performers, and expect the show to close instantly so that they can pocket all the investor money and run. Instead, the musical is so outrageously awful that the audience assumes it's a daring satire. Even when the writer storms the stage to insist that Hitler was a great man, he gets bonked on the head, knocked out cold, dragged off the stage, and the show continues. And the crowd loves it. Then there's Tommy Wiseau's The Room, okay? Tommy Wiseau's attempt at a Tennessee Williams-style drama. Wiseau genuinely believed he was making a serious, emotional film. Audiences reacted the same way the crowd and the producers reacted to Springtime for Hitler. They laughed. They treated it like a comedy. And Wiseau, realizing he couldn't fight the tide, pivoted and called it a black comedy. Both works became cult classics because they failed in spectacular, memorable ways. They weren't safe, they weren't predictable, they weren't down the middle. And that's exactly why the Conformity Gate theory doesn't hold up. Stranger Things didn't deliver a finale so shocking or disastrous that people reinterpreted it as something else. It delivered a finale that was competent, familiar, and ultimately risk-averse. That's not the kind of ending that inspires reinterpretation. It's the kind that inspires speculation because it didn't give fans enough to chew on. But the psychology behind these theories goes deeper than disappointment. Fans invent fake ending theories because they want the story to feel bigger. They want the world to feel richer. They want the emotional payoff they didn't get. And in the age of the internet, theories spread faster than facts. A single TikTok can ignite a wildfire of speculation. A Reddit thread can become canon. Nostalgia amplifies all of this. Stranger Things wasn't just a show, it was a cultural comfort object. When something that nostalgic doesn't end with the emotional punch people expect, they look for explanations that preserve the magic. But none of that means a hidden ending exists. Netflix has no incentive to hide a real finale. They have every incentive to protect the brand, not sabotage it. A bait and switch would permanently damage the show's legacy. It would overshadow every season, every character, every moment. And no studio, not Netflix, not HBO, not anyone, is willing to burn down a billion-dollar franchise for the sake of a twist. This is where Cobra Kai becomes such a useful counterexample. Cobra Kai didn't need a twist. It didn't need a secret ending. It didn't need a conspiracy theory to make the finale feel satisfying. It simply paid off the story it had been telling from the beginning. It honored its emotional core. It closed the loop, and fans rewarded it with near universal praise. Stranger Things didn't do that. It didn't close the loop in a way that felt inevitable, and because of that, fans started looking for meaning elsewhere. But that doesn't mean a hidden ending exists. It means the finale didn't deliver the emotional closure people wanted. And that brings us to the bigger picture. What this entire conversation says about modern fandom. We live in a media landscape where expectations are sky high. Streaming has changed the way we watch, the way we discuss, the way we theorize. Fans don't just consume stories, they participate in them. They analyze them. They build communities around them. And when a story ends, especially a story that defined an era, fans want that ending to feel monumental. But endings rarely satisfy everyone. They can't. The bigger the show, the more impossible the task. And when an ending doesn't hit the emotional notes people expect, they don't just shrug and move on. They search for meaning. They search for closure. They search for a version of the story that feels worthy of the journey. That's what Conformity Gate really is. Not a conspiracy, but a coping mechanism. A way for fans to reconcile the gap between what they had hoped for and what they received. The finale we got is the finale. It may not be iconic, it may not be infamous, but it's the ending the creators delivered. And sometimes, that's all there is. Stranger Things didn't fail spectacularly. It didn't succeed spectacularly. It landed in the middle. And in the world of storytelling, the middle is the hardest place to accept. Not because it's offensive, but because it leaves space for people to imagine something more. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that Netflix hid a secret ending, not that the finale was a conspiracy, but that in the age of streaming, fandom, and endless speculation, the biggest crime a finale can commit isn't being bad, it's being unremarkable. Because unremarkable endings don't get remembered. They get rewritten in the minds of fans. They get replaced with theories. They get transformed into myths about real endings that never existed. And that's not a mystery. That's just what happens when a story ends without giving people the emotional closure they were waiting for.